Padgett with the LSU Ag Center. I'm a research extension plant pathologist located at the Dean Lee Research Station. And here at the research station, we conduct research on the major row crops that are produced in central Louisiana. A lot of this research is funded by the Soybean and Grain Research and Promotion Board, and would not be possible had it not been, or has it not been for their funding. So I just want to show my appreciation to them. As you can see, this soybean field behind me has several different diseases that I would like to cover. One's brown spot, and the other disease is target spot. I also want to talk a little bit about phytotoxicity that's actually caused by a fungicide that could possibly be mistaken for disease. This is how brown spot begins. You'll see these small lesions, little spots. They're brown in the center, of course, but they have these predominant yellow margins or halos. As the disease spreads, you can see that the lesions start to grow together. They can encompass the entire leaf. This is an example of a plot back here that has a pretty good epidemics of brown spot going. It's actually causing some defoliation, and in most cases this is not really a yield limiting disease, but in this particular variety it may cause a little bit of yield loss. The other disease I mentioned is target spot, and both of these diseases start in the lower canopy where you get good leaf wetness periods, more so than on the top of the plant. But in some cases, in some varieties, this disease can defoliate the plant. It's similar to brown spot. However, it starts out almost exactly like you would see brown spot, but as that lesion matures, you get a target-shaped lesion. And that's, of course, where the name of the disease comes from. Both of these are fungal diseases. A lot of our fungicides are pretty effective at managing these particular diseases. Just because a plant has spots on its leaves doesn't necessarily mean it's a disease. And this is an example of actually a burn, ironically, from a fungicide. And the fungicide contains some chemistry in the class of what they call the triazoles. And this particular triazole will actually burn the plant. There's no yield loss associated with this, as bad as it looks, and if I showed you the whole plant, it's just on about 5% or less of the leaves on the plant. It starts as this yellowing, and then it progresses and you get this brown or necrotic, interveinal necrosis they call it. So just be aware when you're out looking around that just because it looks like a disease doesn't necessarily mean it is. Okay, now we're standing outside of I'm standing outside a cornfield, and it's pretty far along. It's going to be cut pretty quickly, but there are several diseases here I want to talk about. There's 3, and 2 of them are actually present. There's a couple of rusts that infect corn. One is common rust and one is southern rust. Common rust is a cooler season rust. It's usually not much of an issue as far as having to manage. It doesn't really impact yield. Once it warms up, like it usually does in Louisiana, the disease goes away. It's going to have these cinnamon brown pustules, and there's 3 things. It's common on both sides of the leaf. It's cinnamon colored pustules, and it's a cool season rust. And that's some tips that I use to kind of remember this. The other rust, however, can be a problem, and it's going to be on a field-by-field basis. It's southern rust, and it's a warm season rust, and it flourishes quite well in warm temperatures, and I'll show you in a minute some symptoms and signs of this particular disease. It's a lighter colored rust. Sometimes they refer to it as kind of a yellow type rust, and it occurs mainly on the upper leaf surface, but also on the stalks. And finally, there's another disease that can be an issue as well. It's known as northern corn leaf blight. And it usually starts as kind of a cigar-shaped lesion. All of these diseases usually start in the lower to mid canopy. And as the northern corn leaf blight disease progresses, you'll have a small lesion, and then it'll develop into a cigar-shaped lesion with spores in the center. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, we talked about 3 diseases, but there's 2 present here in this field. The first I want to mention is southern rust, and you'll see these little raised, almost volcano-type structures. And that's the actual fungus growing. Causes little yellow spots initially, and as it matures, you get these red pustules, is what they're called. You also get these on the stem. Moving on to northern corn leaf blight, this is a more mature lesion. They'll actually start kind of very small, like this. As mentioned earlier, they elongate, kind of elliptical shaped lesion. They can even get bigger. These dark colored centers are the actual spores of the fungus. So these are the 2 diseases that I look for when scouting for corn that could be yield limiting. Okay, so I'm in this grain sorghum field. We're going to talk a little bit about some diseases that are present here in the field. As I mentioned earlier, these diseases are going to start in the lower canopy. And by observation, we see 2 major diseases. One is zone 8 leaf spot, and the other predominant disease is anthracnose. We'll take a look at the symptoms. Okay, we talked about zone 8 leaf spot. This is what zone 8 leaf spot looks like. This is the beginning of the disease. You'll get kind of a small, actually it looks like 2 lesions here. As that lesion matures, it's going to expand, and you can see the red margin, and also that tan or lighter colored center, which will produce some spores. As it continues to expand, this is what it's going to look like and there'll be spores in the center of that particular lesion. I also mentioned anthracnose, and it's a common foliar disease of grain sorghum. It begins usually as just a small red spot. There are some other diseases that cause this, but as that lesion expands, and this is certainly much older, you'll get these black fruiting bodies, as you can see here in the center of the lesion. So we've talked about 2 different diseases, foliar diseases in grain sorghum: zone 8 leaf spot and anthracnose. And again, when you're scouting your field, you're going to look in the lower canopy. Okay, so when scouting for these 2 diseases as well as other foliar diseases in grain sorghum, when you go into the field, you're going to want to look down in the canopy. And the reason these diseases start down in the canopy is you get long periods of leaf wetness relative to the upper canopy. It's real conducive for the growth of the fungus to establish infections. So just keep that in mind.